Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. I want to do something a little different today. I'm going to be working on data of this target, but not this image. So this is an image I did a couple of weeks ago under a more or less full moon of the NGC 2170. I think it's also sometimes called the Angel Nebula. I've got some data that I have already processed in PixInsight, and we're not going to go through PixInsight, but we're going to just quickly look at what the data is and what the opportunities are. And today we're really going to focus on some of the retouching tools in Photoshop to clean up some of these problems. So these are the files we'll be working with in Photoshop, and you can see there's certainly some opportunities here. There's a lot of star removal residual. We've got what looks like some glare coming in from the right-hand side. Not sure what's going on here. This shows up every now and then, but I've got some green and then also some blue of these streaks that we'll have to clean up. More star residual. And then looking at the hydrogen, we have some satellite trails that we'll need to clean up, and just a little bit of, I'm not sure if that's star residual, that might actually be something real, but then we've got some star residual, I think, noise over here, a little bit there. The luminosity, somewhat like the RGB, has a lot of issues with star residual, some more satellite trails, more of that streak down here that we'll need to remove. So we're going to really focus on putting this together and doing some retouching in Photoshop. And of course, what I'm trying to accomplish, and you may have different goals, but what I want to accomplish is to remove things that shouldn't be there, but try to avoid adding something that should not be there. So, for instance, I want to remove the satellite trail, and certainly I want to remove these artifacts down here because those aren't real. But I want to be careful that I do it in a way that we don't add information that's not there either. So let's jump into Photoshop. And like I said, I have not processed this data before, so you'll be following along with me. I'm also going to talk a little bit about continuum subtraction, because as a reflection nebula with a strong HA element, it's a good candidate for continuum subtraction. So we'll start with File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, which brings up this dialog box where we can choose the files that we want to load. And so we'll go to the D drive, to the DreamScope data, and like I have more than I need here. So what I'm going to do is put this in Details. And usually I just keep my folders sorted in descending date modified sequence. So today's the 29th, and looks like I have not yet saved. We've got the luminosity and the luminosity stars. I have not yet saved the hydrogen or the RGB. So I better go back and do that. So here is the luminosity. We've got that saved. Here's our starless RGB. So I need to save this. So you're seeing the real process here. Let's see, luminosity we have saved. HA I have not saved. So navigate to the correct folder. Save this as a TIFF. And in fact, save it as a 16-bit TIFF. Let's see if we've got everything now. Still missing something. We should have We've got hydrogen, luminosity, stars. I think that's it. No, we needed the RGB. Apparently I did not save the RGB file yet. Thought I saved that. Sure it's in the right folder. Obviously it's not been saved, or I would have gotten a warning that I was overwriting it. So back to Photoshop. There we go. Now we have the 4 files that we need. So there's stars, we'll have stars, luminosity, HA, and RGB. So this will be an LRGB plus HA image. So first thing I need to do is, like I always do, is drop things into groups, label the groups. This is RGB. And I almost always wind up using some adjustment layers, so we'll just go ahead and drop a levels adjustment layer in here. Turn that off. Here's our hydrogen. And luminosity. And then lastly, the stars. And we'll drag the stars group up to the very top of the layer stack, put it in screen blending mode. Close that group. Let's start with the luminosity, because that may be one of the simpler to understand. We've got some real bright areas here that we're going to have to do a little bit of toning on this also, I suspect, in order to have everything show correctly. As you can see, there's a lot of artifacts that just don't belong there, plus the stars. So you have options when you work on this. I like to do things that are non-destructive up to a point, and there's at some point working on things non-destructively just seems futile. For instance, if I take out this satellite trail, I'm probably not likely to want to put it back in. The danger is if you make a mistake and you don't realize you've made a mistake until 10 or 20 steps down the road. So in order to avoid that, I'm going to add a blank layer, and I haven't done anything else. In fact, I'll turn off this levels adjustment layer. So the only things active are the layer that we want to fix and a blank layer. And that'll let us put all of the retouching to start with on this blank layer, and we'll just label it heal. And we'll start, I'm going to start by using the remove tool, because when it works well, it's just kind of like magic. So right here we've got a fairly large area, and one of the things I look at is there underlying detail below it, and I don't really see much. So I'm just going to make the brush large enough to encompass this entire star thing, and just click, and it will remove that star thing. Now there is a setting, and I made this mistake the other day. There's a setting up here that says sample all layers. I need to have that checked. And there's also a setting that says remove after each stroke, and right now that's unchecked. So if I sample all layers and I click the remove after each stroke, now when I click, it'll automatically calculate it. You can see the twirling dots, and so it's going to automatically do the removal. Did a pretty good job, although it looks like it duplicated this thing. So let's just click again and get rid of that. Like I say, we don't want to add anything. We want this to be just kind of nondescript fuzz. Now we've got a satellite trail through here, and now we are going to click or unclick the remove after each stroke, because what that lets us do, I just used the left bracket key to make the brush smaller. What it lets me do is click at one end of where I want to operate and then move to the other end and hold the shift key and shift click, and you can see it draws a line connecting those two. And in fact, if I wanted to do more in one operation, I could come up here and click, come down here, shift click, over here, click, and you may not be able to see all of these satellite trails. And then now press the check mark, and it'll go through and do these three at once. So sometimes that's an easier way than having it remove after each stroke. And when the remove tool works well, it's like magic. It does a very good job of blending things that are around what you want to remove. So I'm going to come back up to some of these big spots. And these are mostly in areas where there just isn't anything going on, so I'm not too worried about it because it's what's in the picture is pretty much just unformed nebulosity. Now, down here with these streaks, it's a little trickier because I'm going to need to make the brush quite a bit smaller. And if you go across something, like I just went across this streak, it does a pretty good job of filling in as you go across. Let's do it again with this satellite trail where it goes across these streaks. And we took out a little bit of star residual with that also. Now I'm going to go the other direction and work on these horizontal stripes. I have not been able to figure out what's causing these. And you notice that first time it didn't remove it. Sometimes you have to remove enough that it doesn't pull in something adjacent. And we may reach a point where this tool just isn't going to work very well for us. It is a little bit slower than some of the other options, but I do like it because of all of the healing tools, it probably is one of the best for finding an appropriate blend of surrounding pixels to be able to effectively eliminate the thing that's causing you a problem. And this being notice here again I went across some dark pixels. That looked like that did not work very well, so I'm going to do this in pieces. Some of this we may have to work on a different way. We've still got a little bit of a bright streak in there that we'll remove a different way. So that's probably most of what I can do with the remove tool. We've got some here, but it looks like there may be detail in a lot of this, so I don't want to use the remove tool. Instead, what I want to do is use very careful burning and dodging, which burning and dodging is just the old darkroom terminology for brightening and darkening. And to do that, and I want to do this on top of my heal layer, I'm going to add another blank layer, this time in soft light blending mode. And what soft light blending mode does is let you darken or lighten depending on whether you're painting with a dark brush or a light brush. So we'll grab the brush tool and we can tap the D key to be sure we have our default black and white colors, and we can use the X key to just switch back and forth between black and white. And I usually want to start at about 10% opacity, which I can get to by tapping the 1 key on the keyboard. And let's look at this bright streak over here, and we'll start by just painting over this with that 10% opacity brush. Try to blend it in with the surroundings. So we're not changing anything here, we're keeping whatever detail may have been there. I just switched to the white brush. That's too much, so I'm going to go to a 5% by tapping 0.5 on the keyboard. So now I can very carefully blend this in. And let's do the same thing down here where we have this big star residual. And I'll start by just darkening the whole area so it blends in. And if you're not sure this is star residual, we can always turn the star layer on and off to confirm that there is in fact a bright star here. Yep, a very bright star. We'll do the same thing over here. Just darken this down so it blends in. Same thing down here. And you may find if you take this too far, you'll start to create dark halos around the stars. So it doesn't hurt to leave a little bit of brightness. And we still have quite a few vertical stripes here. I'm going to go back to my healing brush, or to the remove tool. And to do this correctly, I really should turn off this burning dodge layer just in case, since we're sampling all layers. And that's one of the drawbacks of the remove tool. It doesn't have the ability to work with just current and below. The clone stamp tool and the healing brush, you can work with just the current layer and what's below. These are probably some combination of star spikes and satellite trails. This area seems to be a magnet for satellites. And let's go back to our brush tool and this in a little better. Now, if you do something and you find out that you've just gone too far and it doesn't match at all, since we're on a separate layer, you can always just grab the eraser and erase everything that's there and start over. And I actually should be on the soft light layer. So I'm just very carefully darkening some of these stripes here. And you'll find when you have something like a satellite trail, you don't necessarily have to remove it perfectly, but if you break up what's going to be perceived as a straight line, it will disappear, at least to the eye. So I say you don't have to. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be good enough that it breaks up the flow. So as you can tell, once you get into this, you can spend a lot of time perfecting it. And since this is the luminosity layer, I'm spending probably more time than I really would need to. But that's starting to look, I think, pretty good. Let's turn on our levels adjustment, pull the blacks down a little bit, get it a little bit more realistic. These really bright areas I want to darken, and so I'm going to use my burn and dodge layer again with the black brush and just darken these spots locally. Keep those from getting blown out. And I'll probably end up darkening this whole right-hand side, but I want to get a little bit further along. I'll darken this corner. Corners have a tendency to sometimes be bright, and if anything, you want your corners to be dark, not bright. So let's go to our RGB, and this is just going to provide color, so we can be a little bit more, I don't want to say sloppy, but we can be a little bit more aggressive in how we do the retouching, because we're really just retouching for color. So to do that, I'm again going to add a blank layer, And everything on this layer is opaque, so having layers turned on below is not having any effect. And for this, I'm going to use the healing brush. It works somewhat like the clone stamp, except it does a very nice job of blending, and it also has the option to use current and below. So if I had something, some detail turned on above it, it would not affect it. And again, none of this detail is going to show in the finished image. All that's going to show is the color. So we can be a little bit more aggressive here. But we do need to take out the green and the blue. So I'm going to, as I said, be somewhat aggressive here in taking these out. And I'm just choosing to sample from an area that probably has the right colors that we're going to want in the finished image. So here, this is mostly red. You could even just paint over this with a colored brush, sample from areas around it. And I may even come to that. That if we were going to do that, just for example, I would add another blank layer, put it probably in color blending mode, sample that color, and then grab the brush tool, sample that color, and then just paint over it. Something like that. And we can do the same thing up here. And again, all that's going to show from this is color, not any of the detailed texture, other than probably some of the texture in here we may use, probably not. So we now have the opportunity to just turn this into color blending mode, and we now have a color image, and you can see that even though the luminosity looked interesting by itself, it's really much too bright. So we'll come back to our levels adjustment on the luminosity layer and tame it a little bit. Let's say something like that. And now we want to add our, got a color opportunity here that I didn't see because it was behind me right there. So I'm going to come back to the heal, grab the healing brush, and see if we can just knock this out. Yep, let's do it the I am on the wrong layer. So let's come back, let's get on the RGB layer and the healing brush. There we go. That looks better. So we need to add our hydrogen, and that's really going to make this image pop. So let's move the hydrogen layer group up above RGB, and I'll go ahead and turn it on, and let's see what we need to do. It has some retouching opportunities. So I'll add a blank layer for healing. We'll label it heal. And I'm again going to use the healing brush and just paint over some of these satellite trails. We've also got a couple of small satellite trails that go through a lot of detail, and I think those are going to work better with the remove tool. And so again, we'll uncheck the remove after each stroke so we can draw a line. And this is going across detail, so that's good. And I'm going to stop it there. And it looks like there's a little bit of that satellite trail right there. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect as long as you break up the straight line. So, and there was one up here. This may wind up getting cropped out anyway, but this is a fairly noisy image. I don't have a lot of data. And of course, the more data you have, the better job the WBPP can do removing things like satellite trails. And I think the last one, let's go ahead and hit this star. So let's talk a little bit about continuum subtraction. Normally, I see that used most frequently with galaxies like Andromeda and M33. What those have in common is those are RGB targets that you are adding hydrogen to. And then hydrogen, what the continuum subtraction does is it cleans up where the continuous RGB, the broadband RGB, is contaminating the HA. And I think we can illustrate it with this one. If I turn off the hydrogen layer, you can see that we've got just a nice color image. Not a lot of color. We would probably want to probably add a little bit of saturation. And I don't know if the saturation will work a lot better if I add it to the RGB layer. And I don't know if possibly the color balance, it looks a little bit on the blue side, but we'll just let this go for now. When we add hydrogen, remember the hydrogen is, first of all, it's very bright, and this will have to tone it down. But this was captured with a monochrome camera, so everything here is in black and white. So to add hydrogen, what I'm going to do is put this layer in screen blending mode. And then I'm going to double click here to the right of the group layer name. And I'm going to turn off the green and blue channels so that we just have red. So what we're doing now is adding just red. And so now what we're doing is we've added the red to the RGB, or the hydrogen to the RGB. And we can play, because it's a screen blending mode, it's pretty aggressive. But you can see that it tends to add a lot of hydrogen, for instance, in these areas that are reflection nebula. That reflection nebula also has the red color of the hydrogen, and so it's kind of overwhelming the RGB of the reflection nebula. So to fix that, continuum subtraction will subtract out the places where we have just natural red and give us more focus on the hydrogen alpha. Now this works in images that are RGB plus HA. You wouldn't use it in an HOO type of image, because in that case you're trying to maximize the hydrogen or the oxygen narrowband information, and you probably wouldn't want to subtract anything from it because you already have a pretty clean image. It's really, what I have found, it's really when you have an RGB image that you're adding HA to, and you get too much HA in those RGB areas. So in order to subtract it, we need just the red of the RGB. And you may or may not have noticed, but I didn't save just the red of the RGB. I could have split the channels in PixInsight and saved it as a red, but it's real easy to create here in Photoshop, but it is a couple steps. The first thing I'm going to do is, we've already retouched our RGB data, so we don't want to redo that, so we're just going to copy this whole layer group with a Control J. That would be Command J on the Mac. And I'm going to just go ahead and collapse all four of these layers together by selecting those four and then Control E. And I don't need this hue saturation layer. And what I want to do now is turn this into a monochrome or black and white version of just the red, green, and blue channels. And it might make more sense if so this is what the RGB looks like all by itself. And what we want to do is take just the red into its own red, green, and blue channel, because the hydrogen has red, green, and blue in it, so we need all three channels. So to do that, I'm going to use an adjustment layer called the channel mixer. And what it lets you do is select input channels and output channels. So for instance, if we start with red, the red channel is going to be composed of 100% of the red channel. The green channel we want to be also 100% of the red and none of the green. And then the blue channel we want to be 100% red and 0 blue. That is now what we're seeing is a monochrome version of just the red in this RGB image. And we achieve that through the channel mixer by putting the red, green, and blue channels into, or the red channel into the red, green, and blue channels. So I can just apply this now by selecting these two, Control E. We now have our monochrome RGB, and we'll just pull this up above the hydrogen. And in fact, we're done with this layer group, so I can delete it. And let's just turn everything back on. So this is now, if you remember, this is our red continuum. We want to subtract it from the HA. And the way we do that is by putting this layer in subtract blending mode. And you can see it made a difference already. It got rid of a lot of that spillage. We can now adjust the intensity of the subtraction. We'll add another levels adjustment layer, and we'll do what's called clipping it to the red continuum. And I'm going to do that with this clipping icon, which is part of the properties panel. And that caused the levels adjustment layer to inset with a little arrow pointed down. That tells us that this levels adjustment layer is only affecting the red continuum layer. Now I can adjust it and adjust, very carefully and precisely how much of that red I want to subtract and how much I want to let come through. I don't know if there's a right or wrong. There was definitely some hydrogen out here in the luminance area. But I'm going to say that probably looks pretty good. And we're getting fairly close now to a finished image. The last things I would do, I closed this hydrogen layer because I want to now add adjustment layers on top of it. And by having it closed, if I add an adjustment layer, it'll go on top. So I'll add, and this is just pretty standard for me, levels, color balance, and hue saturation. And then the last thing I add is a solid color layer at 19, 19, 19 RGB values, which is 13, 13, 13 hex. And set that to lighten blending mode. And turn that on and off. It's to see it. It's not doing much. If you look over here, as I turn it on and off, it's just having a little bit of an impact over there. So this area probably should be a little brighter. This side should probably be a little darker. So I'm going to come to the levels, the global levels here. Now let's do it on the luminosity because that's really where it is. I'm going to start by lifting the blacks a little bit. I'm mostly looking at this side. Then I'm going to add another levels adjustment layer, and I'm going to darken, particularly the blacks a bit. And I'm really just watching the right side over here because I'm now going to go to the mask, grab the gradient tool, which is, I have black as my foreground color, and it's set to draw from black to transparent. So if I draw from black to transparent, what I have done is created a gradient that masks this levels adjustment layer from having an effect on the left side, but lets it come through on the right side. And then that may cause us to want to come back and tweak the hydrogen a little bit. So that, I think, is starting to look pretty good. If we turn the stars on, get a preview, a lot of stars. So let's deal with the stars. I'm going to start by converting the stars layer into a smart object. And I'm going to do two things. First, I'll use noise, dust and scratches, in probably about a 4 or 5 pixel radius. And what this will do is knock out the little stars, and then I'll restore some of the sharpness by adding a smart sharpen layer, and we'll put some sharpness back into the stars. Then we'll use the levels adjustment layer that's right above this stars layer. And these are things, by the way, that I do with almost every image. And then I'll just darken the stars a little bit, and that'll minimize them a little bit more. You can see the effect it has. Sometimes I will come back and use a black brush to hide that darkening levels adjustment layer on the really bright stars, just to restore those back to their original glory, and just pick some of the brighter stars and let them really shine. So that's looking like a pretty decent image. I think the last thing I would do to this, I'd probably do a couple things. I would probably boost the saturation a little bit globally. We probably want to sharpen some of the details. So I would go to let's start with the luminosity. And when I sharpen this, remember we did a lot of retouching on these two layers. And I want to preserve all of that and sharpen it all together. So I'm going to select these 3 layers, right-click, and convert to Smart Object. So now those 3 layers are all combined into one object that I can now apply my Smart Sharpen to. And this camera generally can tolerate, it usually wants quite a bit of sharpening. By sharpening the RGB luminosity details, we don't really need to sharpen the RGB, it's really just the luminosity. And then we probably want to do the same thing with the hydrogen. And again, I'll select all 4 of these layers because this is the hydrogen minus the continuum, and we want to sharpen all of that. So I'll convert that to a smart object. Filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. And then the last question I guess I would struggle with is the dust that's showing here that looks like it's in front of the hydrogen. Do I have that at the level I want? And that would be driven by the levels adjustment here in the luminosity group. So do I want to brighten this, darken it, or just let it go the way it is? I think I'm going to more or less let it go the way it is. And I'm going to go ahead and call this a finished image. So at this point, I would save this file, save as, and I'll save this in my 2024 photos folder. And I want to save this as a large document format. And we'll NGC 2170. Scope, and this is, I think, around 4 hours. So when this is done saving, and I don't usually do this, but let's go ahead and go through the whole process. So it's done saving. Now I'll open Lightroom. which should still be, and this unfortunately it's a large catalog, so it takes a minute to load, but this should still be focused on the 2024 photos. And what we want to do now, if you recall, we just saved this new document into the 2024 folder. So we need to bring it into our Lightroom catalog. And we do that through a process called synchronization. And what synchronization does is it lets you go, it actually tells Lightroom to go through that folder, find any new photos that aren't already in the catalog, and add them to the catalog, what it calls import. And so it's still loading. My little screen picture here, because the buttons we're going to use will be over here on the lower left. So we can scroll down to the 2024 folder, and this is the folder structure that Lightroom knows about. There's the 2024 photos. So I'll just right click on that and choose Synchronize Folder. And it found one new folder, or one new photo, I should say. Click Synchronize. And now it's going to bring that photo in, and it enters it into the Lightroom catalog, which is an SQL or SQL database that Lightroom maintains on the computer. And that SQL database has all of the information about the photo, including where it's stored, and any development adjustments, cropping, brightness, contrast, color, saturation, any of those kinds of changes that you might want to make to the photo. It shows you the changes, but it doesn't actually apply the changes. It never applies any of those changes to your original photo. It's just, it knows where the original photo is, and it knows how to display it based on the adjustments you want to make. It doesn't actually apply any of those adjustments until you create a derivative of this, generally by exporting the image, for instance, as a small JPEG. So here's the full photo we just created, and I'll go to the Develop module, and I'm going to start by looking at the overall color balance. It looks a little bit on the red side here, so I'm putting a little blue in, maybe a little green also. Looking at the histogram, we can see that the histogram stops a little bit short of pure black. So I'm going to darken the blacks. I don't want to go too far. I don't want to do that where the histogram really runs into the left side. I want to keep it just up against the left side, but not touching it. We may want to play with our highlights and whites to make sure that they're bright but have detail. The clarity is one of the presence functions, and it can work wonders to really make things pop in an image. Texture tends to work more on stars. Sometimes it works okay, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you're actually better off to have a little negative texture, and that will soften the stars a little bit. We go to the Detail tab. I generally have sharpening in around the middle, but I pull the radius down to 0 and I put the detail up to 100%. And then the masking, what this masking does is it tells Lightroom to not apply sharpening in dark areas, only light areas. And you can see where the mask is applied by holding the alternate key and then sliding this. And so it's only going to apply sharpening in those areas that are highlighted white, and the black areas, which are the shadow areas, won't get any sharpening, so you avoid sharpening noise. I usually have a little bit of noise reduction dialed in. And this is where I would crop this image. We've got some more real interesting data over here that unfortunately is not in the frame. So rather than having something bright on the edge of the frame, I'll crop that out. And then to keep it balanced, I'll crop in from the right. So that gets to pretty close to a square frame. Nope, it's still not quite square, so I'd rather have it like that. That, I think, is getting to be a pretty good looking image. It still looks a little bit red in the shadows, but that could be the hydrogen showing through also. So this is probably a good place to quit. That's kind of the whole process in Photoshop and even into Lightroom for processing the image. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, as always, drop those in the comments below and I'll try to answer them. And with that, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.